I'd like to introduce our guest speaker this afternoon. We're starting with Professor Ian McGregor, who's from the Lambert Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapeutics and the Brain and Mind Centre from the University of Sydney. Professor Ian McGregor was referred to me by Professor Sachdev, our medical advisor, because we've had a lot of interest in this area, and particularly with Tourette's. So we're very, very happy to have an expert here today. Thank you.
G'day. Oh. G'day. Actually, I'm a sound engineer in a band, and so I was being a scientist, so I should have got that one with a mic. That was a rookie error. It's great to be here. Well, what a tremendous bunch of people. I always start a talk by looking at the audience and inspecting them really carefully. What a great bunch of folks. Fantastic. And what a nice way to spend a Saturday talking about Tourette's and cannabis and neurology and the brain and all that sort of stuff. And fantastic. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to your association. I'm sorry about the wobble on the display there. We seem to have a bit of an issue with my computer. I hope it's not too distracting as we go along. Now, what I'm going to do today is tell you a wee bit about the Lambert Initiative, where I work. And then we're going to talk a little bit about cannabinoids. Now, if you can say cannabinoid, then that's a great start. You want to try saying that? Cannabinoid. Cannabinoid. A number of people, a number of professors even, that can't say that word properly. It's amazing, you know. It's just, it always baffles me. But if you can say cannabinoid, then you're off to a great start in this particular area. We're going to talk a wee bit about what we know about cannabinoids in Tourette's syndrome and whether they have any chance of being useful. Okay? And then we'll try and answer a really important question, that is, if you want to try cannabinoids, how can you get access to them? Can you, in fact, get access to them in Australia? Because that's a bit of an ideal. So these are the things that I hope to talk to you about. I've only brought 300 slides with me. So this won't take very long at all. Alrighty, well, let's start by talking a wee bit about the Lambert Initiative. Now, we're at the Brain and Mind Centre, just down the Parramatta Road here in Sydney. And there's a lot of neurologists there. Some of you might even go there to see neurologists, maybe. And I'm part of this organisation. We're called the Lambert Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapeutics. Now, the Lambert Initiative's got a really interesting story associated with it. And it's about this little girl here, Caitlin Lambert. And Caitlin has really severe epilepsy, a form of epilepsy called Dravet syndrome. And her daddy, Michael Lambert, discovered that by giving a certain type of cannabis to Caitlin, an oil that she could put in her mouth, her seizures basically disappeared, and she got much, much better. And that's just a wonderful development. The problem is that what Michael was doing with Caitlin was actually illegal, and so he ended up in the criminal justice system, ended up being arrested by the police. I'm glad you see the comedy in it. So anyway, he got taken to court for giving cannabis to Caitlin, and Caitlin's doing really, really well. She's at school, which is unusual for kids who have the kind of illness that she has, so the cannabis has really helped her. And so he got taken to court, he was found guilty, but fortunately there was no conviction recorded, so he didn't go to jail. When I met Michael, he told me about his parents, Barry and Joy. He said, you know, my parents, Caitlin's grandparents, are actually quite rich, and they've been amazed by what cannabinoids did for Caitlin, for the granddaughter, and how well she's got, and they would like to give some money to the University of Sydney to set up a centre for the study of cannabis applied to different illnesses. And so we said, well, that sounds like a jolly fine idea, and please give us as much money as possible. So they came in and met with the head of the university, Michael Spence, this gentleman here, and he gave not $1 million, not $5 million, not $10 million, but $34 million to the university. How about that, eh? That's pretty generous. Yeah, I know. Well, maybe if you ask Mr. Lambert to give you some too, you never know. So that's let us set up all these really nice laboratories where we do a lot of different types of science with cannabinoids. It's been an amazing opportunity to do all sorts of work. And we have tremendous fun, and we've got all these young scientists that are really brainy, much brainier than I am. I get an opportunity to tell them what to do, but they don't really need me. But anyway, they do great work, and we have a lot of fun, and we do things like growing cannabis. We actually grow it. Oh yes, sorry, you want me louder? Okay, sorry about that. And we grow cannabis and we pull cannabinoids, the chemicals, out of the cannabis plants. We make cannabinoids as well from scratch in the laboratory, which is a lot of fun. We work with cells. Now, cells are the building blocks of animals, and sometimes cells are a bit unusual. So in epilepsy, you get abnormal neuronal cells in the brain. In cancer, you get funny kind of cells that proliferate too rapidly. So we use our cannabinoids to look at how these cells behave and to see whether they can stop abnormalities in cells. We also do a bit of work with animal models. Sometimes it's easier when you're developing medicines to work with animals. So for example, we have mice that are epileptic, and we're able to test new medications that we develop in these mice with epilepsy. We also have rats with cancer, and we can test whether our cannabinoids can help with cancer by giving it to the animals. And it's easier to do that with experimental therapies at first than to give them directly to patients, where you've got all sorts of issues. But we also give cannabis to patients too. And we do that in the lab sometimes. We bring people in and we can give them cannabis and they can smoke it or vaporize it. And we look at its effects on their behavior. We look at things like driving, we look at pain, we look at all these things in people that have been given cannabis and look at whether it's helping or not. And we also run what's called clinical trials. And clinical trials are big, elaborate experiments with lots of patients where you try and work out whether a new medication is effective or not. So we're doing quite a lot of clinical trial work at the moment, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later on. And then unfortunately, I've got to spend a lot of time with politicians. I met Tony Abbott a few weeks ago. That was fun. Sort of. And I met who did I meet the other day? I just got back from Europe, and I met the Labour Party's shadow health minister, Catherine, what's her name? Anyone know her name? Catherine King, I think it is, yeah. So I had a good chat with her. So cannabis access for patients in Australia is actually quite complicated at the moment, and it's quite difficult. So in order to change that, you've got to talk to the politicians and the regulators and try and persuade them and give them evidence that cannabis might be useful in a variety of different conditions. So I spent a lot of time doing that. Now it's quite interesting, when Mr. Lambert gave us all the money for the Lambert Initiative, he didn't know anything about cannabis. He really didn't know much at all. And he couldn't help himself. He got very curious, and he ended up buying a cannabis farm in Kentucky. So he's got 550 acres of cannabis under cultivation, and it's easier to do that in Kentucky than to do it in Australia. That's why he went to the United States. And there's me hiding in the cannabis bushes with Mr. Lambert. That's me there. They're 20 feet tall, these plants. They're really amazing. But if you were to smoke these plants, you'd be disappointed if you were trying to get intoxicated. Because they're a special type of cannabis, which is sometimes known as industrial hemp. And so it doesn't have much of, the part of cannabis that gets you stoned is called THC. But different types of cannabis have different levels of THC. And this type of cannabis has very low THC, but it has a whole lot of other cannabinoids that have useful medical properties. And that's one thing I want you to learn about today with cannabis, that it's not just one drug. It's actually more than 100 drugs in the cannabis plant. There's more than 100 cannabinoids in that plant. And most of them actually don't get you stoned, but a lot of them are therapeutically very useful. So this stuff, you could smoke a ton of it and you wouldn't get stoned or intoxicated at all. But it might help you with your sleep, might help you with your pain, might even help you with your tics. You don't know. Maybe it will. And Mr. Lambert uses this crop to produce a thing called Ananda hemp. And that's like a nutraceutical, like a health tonic that people can buy in pharmacies because it doesn't intoxicate you. And people use it for pain, they use it for sleep, they use it for anxiety, and it seems to be quite helpful. And you can also use the hemp to make a cream that you can put on inflamed tissue. So if you've got a sore knee or an ankle or whatever, you can rub it in. And it seems to be quite useful. I had a tennis injury in my foot and it did quite well. So anyway, if you want to buy some Ananda hemp, I've got a few, cases in the car. It's $100 bottle. For you, we'll call it 80, all right? No, I'm only joking. I'm not actually promoting Ananda hemp, but I think it's an interesting part of the story that Mr. Lambert was so excited about what was possible that he grew it. And there's not actually been a lot of clinical trials done yet with Ananda hemp products, so we can't say that it really does anything. We've got to develop more scientific evidence before we're absolutely sure. Mr. Lambert also gave $3 million to set up the Lambert Center in America in Philadelphia, and they're our scientific partners in the USA, and we do quite a lot of work with them. Now, if you want to find out more about our activities at the Lambert Initiative, then that's our website there. If you just Google Lambert Initiative, that'll take you to the website. And if you're interested in the science of cannabis, we have an email that we send out every Tuesday. It's got all the latest developments in medicinal cannabis. And it's a really fast-moving field. There's new studies being done all the time. There's lots of changes at a political level all over the world about cannabis. People are really curious to get more knowledge about this area. So you can go to the news part of our site, and you can subscribe to our email digest, and you'll get that every Tuesday morning. And you'll get a nice email that looks a bit like that, and it's got all the latest stories from the last week in the medicinal cannabis field. And that was this week's digest, and interesting stories about what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the UK, and what's happening in the Blue Mountains in Sydney as well. So it's worth doing that. Now, the reality is that a lot of people, like Michael Lambert, are still dragged into the criminal justice system because they're growing cannabis because they have a health problem that modern medicine hasn't been able to help them with. And they see cannabis as a useful alternative. And this was an interesting story, not far from where I live in the Blue Mountains. The Taylor family, Stephen Taylor there, and that's Morgan and Ariel, Stephen's daughters. And Morgan and Ariel suffer from inflammatory bowel disease, so they have Crohn's syndrome and ulcerative colitis. And that means that you have a huge amount of abdominal pain, you can't keep food properly in your body, the whole of your gut is inflamed. And what their dad found was that growing plants, he was able to make a juice out of cannabis that was really helpful. It took away a lot of their pain, allowed them to eat normally and to put on weight. Morgan was only 30 kilos at one stage. She was so ill, she lost a huge amount of body weight. And a bit like what happened to Michael Lambert, Stephen ended up being arrested by the Springwood police. He had 107 plants that he was using to make juice, and he ended up in front of the court in Penrith. I think it was 2 weeks ago. I was in Scotland at the time, so I wasn't able to attend the court appearance, but he was found guilty as well, but he was put on a good behaviour bond. And this is an important social aspect of what's happening with medicinal cannabis, that a lot of people are producing their own or they're possessing cannabis and they're tending to get into trouble with the police. And one thing that the Lambert Initiative feels would be good, that if people who have a clear medical necessity are not arrested and not prosecuted and don't have to have the threat of jail hanging over them for doing what any reasonable person would do who's run out of options in terms of what modern medicine can give them. I'm going to talk a wee bit about the science of cannabis just for a second. And just to give you a little bit of background so you can educate yourself a little bit more about this complex area, I hope it won't be too boring, but have a little nap for 10 minutes if you don't like science. Feel free to have a sleep or check your phone or do whatever, or come with me on this little scientific journey. There's 3 different families of cannabinoids, actually. There's cannabinoids that you get in the plant, and they're called phytocannabinoids. That word phyto means plant. And as I said earlier, there's more than 100 cannabinoids in the cannabis plant that have a whole bunch of different therapeutic properties. There's also cannabinoids that we make in the lab. They're called synthetic cannabinoids, and some of them are already out there as medicines. We won't talk too much about synthetic cannabinoids today. But perhaps the most extraordinary ones of all are the endocannabinoids. All of our brains and bodies are full of cannabinoid molecules. And these molecules do really important things in terms of maintaining our health and just allowing normal physiological processes to take place. And when you add up all these different cannabinoids, there's more than 700 different molecules that we can call cannabinoids from these 3 different sources. Looks like everyone's still awake. That's amazing. So let's talk a wee bit about the endocannabinoids. Now this is a wee bit technical, but there are a bunch of signaling messengers in our brains and in our bodies, and they do all sorts of really important jobs. They're involved in regulating pain, anxiety, our brain's ability to learn, our appetite, the metabolism of food, inflammation, and just maintaining overall balance in the brain and the body. And the 2 most important ones are called anandamide and 2-AG. There's a whole bunch of others. There's probably about 70 different endocannabinoids in all. And they hit a whole bunch, they influence a whole lot of proteins that regulate excitability in your brain. The most famous receptor that they hit is called the CB1 cannabinoid receptor. And that's the one that when you smoke cannabis that has THC in it, gets you stoned. But there's a whole bunch of other receptors that are involved in other physiological processes. CB2's in the immune system, GPR55 you find in cancer cells. That's a heat sensor receptor. So by hitting all these different targets, they can regulate an immense number of different processes in your body and your brain. And that's the most important one is probably the CB1 receptor. As I said, that's the one that gets you stoned. If you stimulate the CB1 receptor, you get intoxication, and that's what THC does. Now, where are CB1 receptors located? Well, if you look at this schematic of the human brain, a lot of the CB1 receptors are in brain areas that are very relevant to movement. And you may have heard of the basal ganglia, which is part of the brain that is very much involved in movement and also implicated in Tourette's syndrome. And the basal ganglia is that collection of structures that include the caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, and the substantia nigra. So the fact that we have all these CB1 receptors in that part of the brain gives an opportunity for cannabinoids to modulate movement and to modulate tics and so on and so forth. And what we find in general is that CB1 receptors are able to regulate excitability of neurons. Now, if you think of epilepsy, epilepsy is abnormal excitation in the brain. People with epilepsy have these electrical storms in their brain. And if you stimulate CB1 receptors, then that's able to turn down the dial on the excitability of the brain and thereby reduce seizures as well. So if you think of tics, maybe as cannabinoids within the plant, and we call them the bad Scrabbles, because they all have acronyms like THC, CBD, THCV, CBN, CBDV. I don't know if any of you play Scrabble, but can you get a 7-letter word out of any of these? Probably not. Anyway, so most of the cannabinoids are not intoxicating. They don't hit the CB1 receptor, but we know that they have all sorts of interesting therapeutic potential. THCV causes you to lose weight. It inhibits appetite, unlike THC, which gives you the munchies. CBN makes you sleepy. CBDV seems to be useful in autism, from what we're finding out. And CBC has really strong effects on anxiety. It has a very strong anxiolytic, anxiety-reducing properties. So we're learning a lot about all these different cannabinoids in the plant. We've still got about 90 that haven't even been explored yet. Probably only 10 or so have been characterized, and that's one of the things Lambert Initiative is working on at the moment. The two most important ones, THC and CBD, I'll give you a little bit of background about them. So THC is tetrahydrocannabinol, big long word, but it's the one, as I've said already, used for a variety of indications. When people get chemotherapy for cancer, they often throw up and feel really nauseous. And there's a number of good scientific studies that show that THC in the form of dronabinol takes away that nausea and vomiting in people who are undergoing chemotherapy. It's also useful as an appetite stimulant as well for people with anorexia or people in palliative care who are dying, who often don't have much appetite at all. And then there's a whole load of emerging indications. THC may be useful for pain, for spasticity, for insomnia, and there's even a couple of trials that I'll tell you about in a wee minute to do with Tourette, showing that it may be useful for reducing tics. So THC is potentially a very good medicine. You've got to watch out for the dose. If you take too much, you tend to get very intoxicated. But at low doses, it may actually be very useful. It doesn't intoxicate, but may have therapeutic properties. The other one that you should know is called CBD, or cannabidiol. And it's really important. It's getting a lot of attention at the moment. It doesn't intoxicate, so I could give you a ton of CBD, you could eat it, and you won't get stoned at all, but you may get some useful therapeutic effects. It doesn't hit CB1 receptors, but it may tweak the levels of endocannabinoids in your brain to increase them. You can get it in Australia only if you're a child with really severe epilepsy, and some of them get a special syrup with CBD in it, which is called Epidiolex. Very small numbers though. It has a lot of potential in other conditions, psychosis, anxiety, dementia, and addictions, and scientists and clinicians are still working on that at the moment. This is a big study that came out last year showing that CBD was very useful in Dravet syndrome, which is the epilepsy that Caitlin has, but it does other things. You would know antipsychotic drugs that are used in schizophrenia. And this gentleman here, Marcus Lewicki, did a study recently showing, thank you for doing that, by the way. Yeah, that's great. This gentleman showed that CBD was just as effective as standard antipsychotics in reducing schizophrenia symptoms. So CBD has very strong antipsychotic effects, which is interesting. So you hear a lot about cannabis causing schizophrenia in young people. This is showing that this element of cannabis, CBD, is a very strong antipsychotic. It can actually cure, not cure, but reduce the symptoms of schizophrenia.
The antipsychotics, can you remember what they were?
The comparator?
No, yeah.
Well, they compared it with amisulpride in that particular clinical trial and found it was just as effective.
But some of them are used in Tourette's as well.
Yes, that's right. I know amisulpride is used, maripiprazole, and a few other things as well. We're running a trial down in Melbourne for anxiety. Now, when teenagers get anxious, it's really quite hard to treat. Teenage anxiety is a tricky one, and a lot of them get antidepressant drugs. We're trying CBD. We're working with this man here, Professor McGorry, former Australian of the Year, to see whether CBD can reduce anxiety in young kids who attend Headspace centres down in Melbourne. So that's another application. But generally, the problem with medicinal cannabis is it's been illegal for such a long time. There's not a lot of scientific research that has been done. There's not many big clinical trials because there's so much paperwork and so much persuasion to be done to allow you to actually do clinical trials. If we're to summarize the evidence that exists, we know that cannabis is useful for the treatment of chronic pain. We know it's useful for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. And the spasticity that people who have in multiple sclerosis is also evident. These are the ones where we've got very good current evidence. We've got moderate evidence, reasonable evidence for its effects in sleep. And then there's a whole bunch of conditions where the scientific evidence is really still being developed. We've got a bit of a signal, but it's not conclusive yet. And that's in things like increasing appetite and reducing weight loss, MS spasticity, anxiety, PTSD, recovery from traumatic brain injury, and also improving symptoms in Tourette's. So we really have to up the evidence base to convince doctors and to convince politicians and regulators that cannabis is a useful medicine. There's a really important thing that Carl Sagan, the astrophysicist, said, and that is the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So just because a clinical trial hasn't been run yet, or a good quality clinical trial hasn't been run yet in a particular condition, doesn't mean that cannabis isn't going to be effective. We just need to run these better quality clinical trials. And that's a big part of what Lambert Initiative is doing. We're involved in about 8 clinical trials that are either underway or about to get started. We're working in chemotherapy, induced nausea and vomiting, palliative care, anxiety, as I just told you, but we're also working in sleep, dementia. We're doing a trial in alcohol withdrawal as well at RPA, working with anorexia nervosa, and we're helping with a trial of Tourette's that's going on in Queensland, which I'll tell you about in just a second. So what about cannabinoids for Tourette's syndrome? Well, I got help. I was down in Melbourne giving a talk yesterday. I thought, I better get some slides together for my talk today. And I was rather busy as well as being a wee bit sick. I got a flu on the way back from Scotland. So I recruited one of our very fine young scientists at the Lambert Initiative. This is Anastasia Surya, and she's a clinical neuropsychologist. I said, Anastasia, please, can you put some slides together for me for my Tourette's talk? And she did that. And one of the things that Anastasia has been working on recently, and it was just published last week, is a big study with families in Australia who have epileptic children who are using illegal cannabis products to treat their children. And that's called the Pelican Study, and she just published a paper on that a couple of weeks ago. As I say, I'm very lucky to work with all these brilliant young scientists, and that was a great study that Anastasia did. So let's have a look at the slides that she produced for my talk today. I'm seeing them for the first time. I hope they're good. So we'll start by saying, what are the current treatments? And we just had a wee chat about that there. And there's no hard and fast rule for pharmacological treatment of tics. There's no absolute 100% medication that's almost used for tics. If you review the existing evidence, then there's some evidence that antipsychotics, as we just talked about, aripiprazole, and also drugs like clonidine, which are used mostly in children, I understand, with Tourette's, can have clinically meaningful benefit, but often quite short-term benefits. So that's what Anastasia told me. The problem with these drugs is that there can be intolerable adverse effects. So people on long-term antipsychotics can have weight gain, they can show problems with feeling sleepy and sedated, and also it can cause extrapyramidal symptoms, so they end up with strange movement-related problems. There's also CBT, so you can see a psychologist, and that can sometimes work very well for people, but not always. And then there's deep brain stimulation as well, which you've probably heard about it, and that's only been done with quite a small number of patients, and it's quite invasive because it involves getting an electrode put in your brain. But if it works, it might be worth doing that. And cannabinoid treatment shows some promise. Why would you use cannabis for tics? Well, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, basically because cannabinoid medicines may help to reset equilibrium in your endocannabinoid system. Maybe Tourette's involves some sort of abnormal disturbance in the cannabinoid system in your brain, so giving cannabinoids may actually help restore that balance. This is a very busy slide that tells you all the evidence that we've got for Tourette's syndrome at the moment. And we have a number of what's called case reports, and that's where doctors try something experimental, maybe just with one patient, so they get a patient with Tourette's, give them some cannabis, and hey, their tics went down, so they write it up quickly and publish it in a medical journal. But often that's just one patient, and to generalize to all people with Tourette's, you need much bigger trials involving dozens or hundreds of patients. So we've got case reports, we've got case series, and when you do bigger trials, they're called randomized clinical trials, or RCTs. And there's a German psychiatrist, neurologist, Kirsten Muller-Wahl, who's the only person that's done RCTs in Tourette's so far, and they were quite small in terms of numbers. There was just 12 patients in one, 24 in the other, and both involved THC. We saw that dronabinol product earlier, the capsule, the THC in it. Both of her trials involved that, and she got clinically meaningful reduction in ticks in both trials with the THC product. What we're going to do with Philip Mosley up in Queensland is to keep THC in the mix, but we're also going to add CBD, because CBD seems to reduce anxiety, it has these antipsychotic effects, it increases endocannabinoid levels in the brain, and it may also have interesting anti-obsessive effects as well. There's a lot of commonality between OCD and Tourette's, as many of you will know. So this is a trial with just 24 adults. It's funded by the Wesley Medical Research Institute in Queensland, and the Lambert Initiative is throwing in some funding as well. So we're really excited about this trial, and we're hoping that we'll get a positive result with this medication here, which is taken orally. I'm sorry if you're not from Queensland, you probably won't be able to participate in this trial, but if this one is successful, we'll try and roll out a bigger trial in New South Wales that might help those of you that are based here. There's a whole lot of other clinical activity that is going on around the world with cannabinoids and Tourette's, and a lot of it has been done by this German psychiatrist, Professor Kirsten Müller-Wahl, who I met last year when I was in Cologne. And she's a very interesting character. German psychiatrists are always very interesting. You get 2 episodes of Fawlty Towers all at once. Hey, someone got a joke. Don't tell her I told her. That's what I said. Okay. Oh, you're recording. Okay, well, that's it.
I'll just email them.
She's an interesting character anyway. So what's she do? Well, one way of giving cannabis, medicinal cannabis, is in a vaporizer. So it's not smoking. When you smoke stuff, you burn it, and it tends to be bad for your lungs. So if you have a bong or you have a joint, you're actually burning the cannabis. And it's not as good as vaporizing. It just heats it up to about 200 degrees Celsius and releases the cannabinoids at that temperature. So it's a much cleaner way of inhaling cannabis than smoking. And that's one of the Kirsten Müller-Wahl studies. She's doing 68 adults with Tourette's syndrome that are going to be vaporizing cannabis plant material that has THC. And they're going to look at the global tick severity scale to see if ticks go down. So that should be a very interesting one too. She's also going to do a study that combines THC in a capsule with one of these endocannabinoid substances. This one's called PEA, and you actually find PEA in some naturally occurring foods. So she's doing a combination of THC and PEA to try and tweak the endocannabinoid system and see whether that works. And that's quite a small trial with just 18 adults given that treatment over 12 weeks. But it's quite interesting, it's experimental. Now there's another product that is a mouth spray, and you basically just spray your cannabinoids into your mouth. It's in the form of a kind of watery substance, and they're absorbed through the membranes of your mouth and into your bloodstream. And that is called Sativex or Nabiximols. It's got 2 names, Nabiximols or Sativex. And so she's also doing a trial of Sativex in Tourette's, and that's starting now, and there's quite a lot of patients, 96 adults, who either get that or get a placebo. And usually these big trials need a placebo control, so some of the patients unfortunately just get water rather than the medication, but that's the only way that you can do a proper clinical comparison. And then probably the most exciting or innovative one that Kirsten's doing, it's only with 19 adults, is a very early stage trial of a substance that increases the levels of endocannabinoids in your brain by interfering with the enzyme that normally breaks down endocannabinoids. And that endocannabinoid enzyme is called MAGL. MAGL mashes up endocannabinoids, breaks them down. So if you inhibit MAGL, you get increased cannabinoid levels in your brain. And this has a very memorable name, this particular drug. It's called ABX1431. See if you can, I'll have a quiz later on, we'll see how many of you remember it. But anyway, that's very interesting because if you take ABX1431, you don't actually get stoned, but you get a subtle increase in endocannabinoids in your brain. And we've got some early results from that trial suggesting that there's about a 10 to 30% reduction in tics and urges to tick as well with this particular substance, but it's just a single dose. Maybe if they up the dose, which they might do in a later trial, they'll get a more convincing clinical effect. So that's really quite interesting. Another thing that Kirsten's been looking at is driving. And what she showed in this case study, and driving is a big issue for people with who are taking medicinal cannabis, because if you're out on the roads, then this sort of thing happens all the time. In New South Wales and Queensland, you get tested for THC in your saliva. And what she showed actually was, in this case anyway, that driving was improved in this Tourette's patient when they took a cannabinoid. So by restoring normal endocannabinoid function in the brain, there was an improvement in concentration and visual perception. So this is one of the interesting things about the whole driving debate, that if you don't have a particular condition, then taking THC may actually impair your driving. But in certain cases where people have, say, ADHD, or maybe Tourette's or some other form of illness, epilepsy maybe, the cannabinoids may actually serve to improve driving function. And one of the nice toys we've got in the Lambert Initiative is the best driving simulator that you can buy in Australia. And we're getting people to vaporize cannabis and looking at how it affects their driving performance using that particular bit of apparatus. So we're hoping that when we start testing patients, we may actually be able to show in some cases that driving's improved. Now, in the last 2 or 3 minutes of my talk, and then we can have some questions, I'll just talk a little bit about what you guys can do to access products, which I think is probably an important aspect, and it's quite a tough business. The easiest one to get is this spray, the Sativex spray, or the Biximols as it's sometimes known. And that's actually available. It's a registered medicine within Australia, so you can ask your neurologist or psychiatrist to write you a script. And it's that easy. If they're prepared to prescribe it, you should be able to get it, and it contains both THC and CBD. And it's distributed by a Victorian company called Emerge Therapeutics. They're down there in Victoria, and they marketed Sativex late last year. So its primary indication is for spasticity and multiple sclerosis. But Kirsten Muller-Val is obviously running a big trial of whether it works in Tourette's. But if you wanted to try a cannabinoid product, that's probably the easiest option that we currently have. There's a few issues with it. It's not subsidised by the PBS, so you may well have to spend quite a lot of money to get hold of it. That's I think it's about $700 per month, which is an awful lot of money, I know. But don't quote me on that. That was just someone told me that they spoke to someone whose next door neighbour knew it was $700 per month. But you can certainly have a conversation with your specialist or your physician about that. And he or she would have to write an off-label prescription. It's not actually approved for Tourette's by the TGA, but most neurologists, most doctors can write an off-label prescription, and they do that sort of thing all the time. There's no solid evidence for its use in Tourette's yet, and the amount of CBD is lower in Sativex than we would think would be useful in things like anxiety, but you never know, but it is quite a low dose of CBD. And also, as pharmacologists, we think that putting it in the mouth and waiting for it to be absorbed across the mucous membranes of the mouth is not a very good drug delivery system, but it does work sort of, but not as good as a capsule or other forms of delivery that might be used. Now, the other path is to talk to your specialist about accessing a whole range of other cannabinoid products that you can access through what's called the Special Access System Category B, or SASB scheme. It's a real mouthful, but SASB is a way that the TGA allows doctors to access unregistered products for their patients. And it requires an application that can be quite complicated, where the doctor justifies the use of that particular product in that particular condition, and we're not sure whether any applications for Tourette's have been successful to get medicinal cannabis for Tourette's patients from the TGA. But there are a wide range of cannabinoid products that are being warehoused in Australia, and the TGA has information on all these products on its website there, and it includes a whole lot of oral THC products, THC in liquid form or in capsules, a whole range of THC and CBD containing products with different ratios, 1:1, 10:1, 20:1. So if you wanted a product with a lot more CBD, you could get it this way. They also have cannabis plant material that you can vaporize or use whichever way you want, or some full spectrum extracts of cannabis that have all the goodies, not just THC and CBD, but all the other cannabinoids as well. So there's a range of options there. And here's some of the products that are available that you can see on the TGA website. And there's the form that your doctor has to fill in for a SASB application. There's also a website called Cannabis Access, and that also has all the products and explains how you might be able to access and the process involved. And this company, Cannabis Access Clinics, has just opened a clinic in Sydney, and I think one in Melbourne as well, where you can go and have a consultation about medicinal cannabis. They will charge you $300, however, which is a bit regrettable. The problem with Category B SASB access, there's a couple, you've got to persuade your specialists. So not all neurologists, and actually very few specialists, are knowledgeable about medicinal cannabis, so you're going to have a very frank conversation with them, and you may even have to try and persuade them. Get them to call me if you like. I don't mind having chats with specialists, but you need your specialist on site to do that application. And we're not sure yet whether the TGA would approve an application given the evidence base that we have for Tourette's. We've just got a few case studies in these 2 little clinical trials by Kirsten Miller-Val. And it's not entirely clear what product you would choose given the small evidence base. And then, probably worst of all, cost. None of these products are subsidized by the PBS, and they can be very expensive indeed. And I'm not saying that it will be this expensive, but when we do the sums for a child with pediatric epilepsy accessing cannabinoid products through the SASB, it's almost $60,000 a year. And who can afford that? People with chronic pain trying to get plant cannabis will be up for about $20,000 a year. But some of the oils that might be useful in Tourette's could end up being quite a bit cheaper than that. And new companies are coming onto the market all the time, and the more competition, the cheaper things may become. But also agitate with your politicians and regulators about price, because the scheme that's been rolled out by the government is basically unrealistic. The products that are available are too expensive for most ordinary people to be able to afford. And I've written about that in the Sydney Morning Herald recently, why so few Australians are accessing medicinal cannabis and its cost. It's the reluctance of specialists to get involved and all the red tape involved in the process. The number of patients in Australia that are accessing official medicinal cannabis is 1,072 as of yesterday. We contacted the TGA to ask about that, and they were quite proud. We've got more than 1,000 patients. That's fantastic. But if you do the sums to work out how many people are using illegal medicinal cannabis to medicate a condition in Australia, we reckon it's probably 100,000. Okay, so they've got 1,000 down, maybe 99,000 to go. And that figure comes by comparing us with other countries. So if you look at Canada, where they've got a very mature medicinal cannabis scheme where you can get legal medicinal cannabis, there's more than 300,000 patients. And that's for a population of 38 million, not much more than Australia's 25 million. Israel's got 30,000 patients for a population of 8 million. And Germany, which has only just started a medicinal cannabis scheme, has 50,000 patients. So there's a bit of work to be done. I had a few more slides, but I think I've probably spoken enough, so I'll maybe just zip forward to my very last slide, which is that. And thank you very much for your attention.
That was fabulous. Thank you so much. I've got the text, so I'll just quickly start with that question from the family in WA. It's probably something you may not necessarily be able to answer. Can you, although more research is required regarding cannabis products such as Anata hemp Do you think it's useful and safe to try on a 6-year-old just diagnosed with Tourette's who's not taking any meds at present due to recent negative experience with risperidone for vocal tics? They now have more motor tics and anxiety, so I want to try to get on top of it with a more natural approach.
Well, even though my car is full of Ananda hemp products and I'm prepared to actually go for $75, it's not a legal product within Australia, so I'm not in a position to condone its use. However, what I would suggest that this family does is talk to their paediatric neurologist about a range of products that are probably fairly safe. So, for example, Epidiolex, which is CBD only, it has no THC in it, has been given to thousands of children, some as young as 3, as part of the epilepsy trials that have been going on all around the world. So we know its safety profile in young children, and I think SASB application for a CBD product with a pediatric neurologist would stand a reasonable chance of getting up there. There's a real issue with THC in children, and that is that the medical profession are very, very scared of THC. And it's interesting that in Anastasia's study, which I showed you, that she just published recently with community use of illicit medicinal cannabis products in children with epilepsy, we found that a very large number of the products, when we did the chemical analysis, had low doses of THC in them. And as I said about THC earlier, there's probably a threshold where it doesn't intoxicate at all, but may still maintain very useful therapeutic properties. And I'd be happy to point this family in the direction of literature that suggests that low-dose THC may be very useful. So you can certainly try CBD only. That's probably not too controversial with a child. And if that fails to work, then you could combine the CBD with maybe a small amount of THC if the neurologist was prepared to get on board with that sort of application.
I have a question. Right, because I'm still texting at Scott. That's okay. I'm just wondering, and I do have a bit of an understanding about why pharmaceuticals are so expensive, because I work in the Department of Health. But for something like cannabis, which is a plant, and you're deriving whatever from, you're not having to make it from scratch per se, why then is it so expensive for you to purchase just because it's not on the PBS?
Well, it's an excellent question. And the reason is this, that the government enacted the legislation about 2.5 years ago to set up a domestic medicinal cannabis cultivation scheme, so companies could apply for licenses to cultivate and so on. But there were very onerous conditions. You basically had to build Fort Knox. You'd think that the companies were making plutonium or something like that. And so that has meant that it's taken an enormously long time for domestic companies to start cultivating and manufacturing. So nearly all the products that are warehoused at the moment have been brought in from Canada or Europe. And the companies, what are the companies in it for? To make money. They see an opportunity to have this huge markup. And I had a conversation with some of the people from Canopy Growth Corporation, who are the biggest medicinal cannabis company in the world out of Canada. And they had a look at the prices when they visited Australia and said, this is just bloody ridiculous. You guys are paying 10 times too much for your medicinal cannabis products. And the good news is that they want to become very active in Australia, and they're promising to drive the prices down. So hopefully that will happen sooner rather than later. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Just out of curiosity, have there been many trials in countries where cannabis as a drug is, as a illicit drug, is legal? And are there, and if the medical forms are in use in those countries as well?
Right, so if I understand your question correctly, are people using illicit medicinal cannabis in countries for Tourette syndrome?
So with the research into the and the numbers of people over the world using the CBDs and and THC medical use drugs, are they also being used in countries where marijuana is a legal substance?
Yes, they are, very much so. So a lot of the trials that were done with CBD and also THC were in America, and there's a lot of states now where cannabis products are completely legal. So you get both things going on side by side. When we talk to families with epileptic children, what they really want is a pharmaceutical product. They don't want to be using backyard oils and tinctures and things that they buy down the pub from some vault for their child. And this is a tragedy of access being so difficult that people are driven to using products that are on the illicit market and have no quality control associated with them. And we did a big trial of, there was more than 1,700 Australians were using illicit medicinal cannabis. I didn't have time to talk about it today. And we did find some patients with Tourette's who were using illicit cannabis. And Kirsten Muller-Wahl has surveyed German Tourette's patients who are using illicit products, and a lot of them are saying that it's highly effective, and that's what we found as well. So, the illicit market is used when people can't access pharmaceutical product. And strangely, I mean, Kirsten's study, I think, suggested that smoked cannabis was the most effective thing that Tourette's patients could find on the illicit market rather than oils and so on and so forth. But yeah, I'd rather not recommend illicit cannabis use. Yeah.
That's an interesting question. Yeah.
It is. It's a very good question.
Yes. Oh, sorry. There's one more.
Oh, hi. Yes. You were talking about the clinical trials in Queensland for adults. I'm just wondering if there's going to be anywhere within Australia, preferably Queensland, because I'm from there, where they're going to trial for children.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's obviously a neurodevelopmental issue, Tourette's, and you want to get to children. I mean, this is what we find with epilepsy as well, that there are a lot of adults with epilepsy. There's kind of the converse there, that all the clinical trials have been done with children, because you have this catastrophic developmental thing with epilepsy. If children like Caitlin are left just to have hundreds of seizures a week, then they end up terribly disabled as a result. And I guess you could say with Tourette's, maybe if you can put a brake on it early on, that's probably ideal in terms of your developmental trajectories. So I think it's much easier in Australia in the current status quo to give cannabinoid products to adults. The child studies with in epilepsy have largely taken place overseas. So we'll start with Philip on that trial, and if we get encouraging results, I think we would get into a child clinical trial as quickly as possible.
I've done some reading that says that THC can sometimes cause, or high levels of it, psychosis, where there's a genetic predisposition towards schizophrenia. What would you recommend if there's a mixture of that with Tourette's syndrome in a family history?
Yes, THC is very complicated in that regard. I mean, the link between THC and psychosis exists. It's sometimes overstated. I would say that if you're a daily cannabis user and you're an adolescent, and your risk of developing psychosis is probably doubled relative to not using cannabis. And if you've got a family history, that will be magnified even more. So obviously non-THC products, and I think the interesting thing about CBD is that it increases endocannabinoid levels. So I think a CBD-only trial in Tourette's would be a very interesting development, and I'd like to support something like that. And then you've got things like what Kirsten Muller-Wahl's doing with the MAGL inhibitor, where you can get a subtle increase in endocannabinoids without having to use THC. THC is a bit of a blunt instrument, the way that it hits CB1 receptors. It's going to be a while. I think it'll be another 5 or 10 years, but we'll have medications in the future, but somewhere in that sunrise that will have a more subtle effect in the brain and be useful. The other thing to bear in mind is that we're starting to see effects of THC down at 0.1 of a milligram, 0.01 of a milligram, tiny doses. So microdosing of THC will probably not have any effect in terms of psychosis vulnerability and could conceivably be quite useful. That's another possible approach.
Just a question, please. Actually, for myself. I've been treated over 30 years. I'm probably the oldest here, but I still take Epilim, and I find it a wonder drug. I take 1,500 of it a day, and I have Tourette's. I mean, I keep it inwardly. I'll let it all out later. And I've also been OCD, but I wasn't diagnosed till I was nearly 40. And I'm coming up to mid-70s. I've been a life member here for some years now, and I haven't attended, and I'm really delighted to have come today to find out what you're saying about it. But there was no medication like I'm saying used. Is it still used, or am I one of the old farts and darts that's only using it? I mean, really, I'm on it every day, and I can't miss it.
That's really fascinating. I didn't get Anastasia, unfortunately, to dive into that question, but I'd be very happy to take it on notice, and I can ask her to survey the clinical trial literature. In fact, I'll put this slide up. Any of you, feel free to contact me or the Lambert Initiative on this email address here. It's just lambert.initiative@sydney.edu.au. And we're happy to answer any questions that you might have, or if you're trying to make an application to get hold of a medicinal cannabis product with your neurologist, and they're often very busy people, and it's quite a complex application process. We're happy to reach out and assist your doctor as well, and educate and tell them what we know about this field. So do not hesitate at all to be in touch if we can help. And I think that Epilim question is really interesting. If that is beneficial for you, something that we should be looking into.
Thank you. I think we'll stop there. That was fascinating, and I think my biggest takeaway is we need an insanely wealthy grandparent. To get behind research like this, because it does take an extraordinarily large amount of money, but it's wonderful to see that they're able to enable that, and we live off the back of that, which is brilliant. So thank you so much.